So now we've reached the point in time where we're going to build out some UI next to our application. What I want to do is then bind a few events and then tie in some handlers to update our local and then subsequently our session storage. So what we're going to do inside our h1 tag, what I'm going to do first is just convert these over to backticks because I want to use multi-line strings. So we'll bump this down onto its own line, and underneath we can go ahead and create a div. Now this div is going to essentially be our cookie banner. And don't get this confused because we're not actually going to be creating any cookies. We're just simply going to be saving the choices in local storage. So first we'll create this p tag and we can say, would you like a cookie? Of course, we want to also add a nice emoji in there. And underneath, I'm going to create some buttons. So here we're going to say button type equals button. We can close off our button. Now, what I'm going to do is just duplicate this. This is going to be the accepting of the cookies. So here we're going to say yes. And our second button will then be no. So let's save this out and see what it gives us. So we have this nice, would you like a cookie? Yes and no. Now we don't have any events at the moment, so this is going to be the next step for us. And these events are then going to drive our local storage updates to then save the user's preferences or not. So first things first, we want to grab a reference to our div, and then we want to go ahead and grab a reference to each button. So what I'm going to do is create some selectors. So the first one that we'll create is going to be the cookie itself. We could call this cookie banner. I'm just going to keep it nice and short. So for this, we're going to use a query selector. Now, we don't actually have any selectors. However, I'm going to call this the data-cookie. So this is just something that I like to do when adding custom JavaScript behavior to DOM elements. We can add this attribute selector. So these square brackets are in fact an attribute selector, which means that we can add a custom data attribute to our div here. So that's all we need to do is simply just add it onto our div. Similarly, on our buttons, I'm going to create a data-cookie, and this is going to be -accept. This is then going to be data-cookie-reject. So we're going to have a handler for accepting and rejecting the cookies, and then I like to just scope our selectors with this data-cookie parent selector. So this gives us a reference to the parent, and we could log this out, but we'll leave it for now. We can then say that our accept node is then going to be cookie.querySelector, and we can then use another attribute selector and say data-cookie-accept. We can go ahead and duplicate this, rename our constant and our selector over to reject. So we have our data cookie parent selector set up, and then from the returned node, so from this particular node, we're then diving down with another query selector to grab that data cookie accept and the data cookie reject. If we wanted to then go ahead and say console.log accept and reject, we can say those out and we can jump into the console, and we then have our two buttons. So it's at this point that we want to then go ahead and start binding some event listeners. So here we'll set up our first event listener. We can say accept, add an event listener of click. When we then click on this particular item, we want to do something and save the user preference, but we also want to hide this banner. Now you can imagine this banner sort of pops up here and it might be floating. It's totally up to you how you would want to style this kind of element in an application. Now what we'll do is duplicate this and we'll change this over to reject. Now inside of our accept handler, what we're going to do is take our local storage and then set this cookie's value. So where we have our set value, get value, remove item, all these kind of things, we don't actually need them at the moment. What I'm going to do is just blow them away, and we're going to then keep our set value function. So I'm going to copy this value and just simply delete it. This then gives us set value, get value, remove item, and empty. So when we move up, we want to do something like this inside our accept handler, and then inside the reject handler, we can then set the value of false to our cookies. Now, because we're not using any of these values, they will in fact error on us. So what I'm going to do is just comment them out for now so we get no red underlines. So if we save this out, we can jump into our application panel. Now, if I say yes, we can then jump into the local storage and you can see that we have cookies true. If I then hit no, back to yes, you can see that that value is then toggling. Now imagine that we were to hide this. So the user then comes back to the site at a certain point in time. If we were to save our false value in our local storage, it means that we can never ask them again if they would perhaps like to accept our cookies. So it might be that we want to in fact use session storage for this and local storage for this. Because when we accept a cookie, we might as well just assume that the user wants to accept it essentially forever, so we can store it in the local storage. If we reject it, it might be that they accidentally rejected it, so then we can ask them again when they revisit, or it might be that we've updated or changed our cookies at a certain point in time, and we want to then ask them again, do they want to accept the new ones? So what this means is we can say const show cookie. This is then going to be a nice function that targets our cookie style attribute. And then we're going to say display equals block. Similarly, we also want to have a hide cookie function. And you guessed it, this is going to be a display value of none, which means that our div up here needs to have an initial style of display and none. So on page load, this is going to make our div completely invisible, which means that after a few seconds, and I'm going to choose 2 seconds here, we're going to run our show cookie function, which also means that when our user either accepts or rejects, we then want to run our hide cookie function. So let's save this out. We can see that our div is then hidden and that comes into view. We can then say, yes, we want to accept. You can see our cookie value here has been updated and everything has been hidden. We can then refresh. We then see the cookie banner again after 2 seconds. We can press no. This sets it to false. And each time we refresh, we're then presented with the same choice, which we obviously want to go ahead and start fixing. We don't want to keep asking the user every single time they reload the page whether they want to accept our cookies. So this is where session and local storage is going to come into play. So what we'll do is leave it there for this video. What we're going to do in the next couple of videos is start to build out a web storage utility module, and then we can start adding some conditional checks of whether the user has used local or session storage, and then we're going to then show our cookie banner accordingly. So that's it for this lesson. This was just a nice lesson on binding some DOM events and then incorporating it with our local storage. So let's dive into the next lesson and carry on building out this example.